The white in-laws disrespected and try to humiliate the black grandmother of the groom, dismissing her as if she were invisible, mocking her appearance with whispers and cold stares. But what they didn't know was that the quiet, elegant old woman they belittled carried a legacy that would silence the entire room. In a single moment, the woman they dismissed and looked down upon becomes the most powerful person in the room. Behind her modest smile lies a legacy that outshines their wealth, and by the end of the night, they'll wish they had treated her differently. Stay tuned and watch the story unfolds. Luxury whispered from every corner. Waiters in white gloves balancing trays of champagne. Laughter bubbled through the crowd. A mix of investors, old money socialites, and legacy names that had graced society columns for generations. Amid the gleaming spectacle, Maeve Brooks stepped out of the town car that brought her to the estate. She wore no designer, label gleamed from her neckline. Her tailored light gray dress suit was simple, hemmed just below the knee, and pressed with care. On her hands, faint calluses remained, a quiet testament to years of hard work. Her gray hair, swept neatly into a bun, caught the sunlight like a crown. She stood for a moment, taking in the scene. Then, with a quiet breath, she walked into it. No one rushed to greet her. As Maeve made her way down the garden path, the murmurs around her shifted. Guests glanced in her direction, then turned away just as quickly. A few offered polite, tight-lipped nods. Most didn't acknowledge her at all. Standing on the veranda with a flute of champagne in hand, Cynthia Montgomery watched the approach with narrowed eyes. In a tailored cream suit adorned with pearls and arrogance, she leaned slightly toward her husband, Richard, and whispered something under her breath. He chuckled, not subtly. Maeve passed them without pause. The Montgomerys didn't speak to her. They didn't need to. The air around them spoke volumes. Tight smiles, raised brows, glances exchanged like inside jokes. They didn't see a woman of grace and resilience. They saw someone who didn't belong. Maeve said nothing. She didn't need to. Her dignity wasn't the kind that shouted. It was the kind that stood taller in silence. As she took her seat near the middle row, neither tucked in the back nor daring to claim the front, no one joined her. The chair beside her remained empty, despite the crowd. The chatter around her swirled on, never touching her. But she wasn't uncomfortable. This wasn't her first time sitting alone among those who thought they were above her. From across the garden, Ethan spotted her. He stood with his groomsmen, half lost in the chaos of photographers and last-minute preparations. But the moment his eyes found Maeve, his face changed. A small smile tugged at his mouth, full of gratitude. He raised 2 fingers in a brief wave. She answered with a subtle nod, her expression softening. He saw her. That was enough. Still, tension quietly simmered. As more of the Montgomery family arrived, great-aunts in fur shawls despite the heat, uncles with cufflinks worth more than college tuition, Maeve's presence was either ignored or dismissed entirely. They didn't even bother to ask who she was. One woman muttered behind her fan, "I assumed she was with the staff." Another replied, No, she's his grandmother, apparently." From his side, the words hung in the air, dipped in judgment. Maeve heard. She always heard, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she looked toward the altar, where her grandson would soon stand, proud and steady, and folded her hands gently in her lap. Let them whisper. Let them underestimate. The estate glittered around her, drowning in borrowed elegance, but none of it could touch the quiet strength in Maeve Brooks' eyes. She wasn't here for their approval. She was here to witness her grandson's step into his future. And nothing, not the silence, the glances, or the gilded arrogance, could dim the power of that purpose. The clink of champagne glasses and the soft strains of string quartet echoed across the Montgomery estate as the reception slipped into full swing. Servers in crisp uniforms moved like shadows through the crowd, offering caviar-topped canapes and golden flutes of Veuve Clicquot. Laughter sparkled in the air like perfume, conversations bubbling around politics, hedge funds, and legacy vacations in St. Tropez. Maeve Brooks stood near the edge of the courtyard, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her posture was dignified, her presence quiet, but her eyes missed nothing. She had tried, gently, to initiate a conversation with a couple near the cocktail table. Older guests who were likely family friends. But the moment she'd spoken, their smiles had stiffened, their eyes flickering past her shoulder to search for someone. Anyone more familiar. "Oh, excuse us," the woman had said, lifting her glass without making eye contact. "We just spotted someone we've been meaning to speak with." They hadn't even tried to mask the exit. Maeve turned back to the view, watching the evening sun stretch long fingers across the lawn. Another group gathered nearby, 2 men in tailor navy suits and a woman in a sequin sheath. They were deep in conversation about real estate development in Aspen, but when Maeve offered a polite smile and a quiet good evening, their words faltered just long enough to let the silence thicken. No one responded. One of the men glanced at her, then resumed his sentence as if she hadn't spoken at all. She noticed how their expressions changed when other guests approached, how they leaned in to shake hands, to laugh, to compliment. But with her, there was only cool distance, polite evasion, and that thin, invisible wall she had encountered too many times before. Across the garden, Cynthia Montgomery stood with her sister and 2 other relatives. Her voice, usually low and smooth, rose just enough to carry. "I suppose we should have included a note in the invitation," Cynthia said, turning slightly toward Maeve, "about what counts as formal attire. You'd think it would be obvious, wouldn't you?" There was a smattering of quiet laughter, that insidious sort of mirth dressed in pearls and red lips. Maeve heard. She didn't turn, didn't bristle. She merely glanced down at her dress. A navy blue, modest, well-fitted, and smoothed the fabric with the same grace she used to hold her family together when life tried to tear it apart. Cynthia kept talking, her voice honeyed but sharp. "And those shoes, they're a choice." "Mother," Madison muttered under her breath, glancing nervously at her guests. "Oh, come now," Cynthia smiled. "I'm just being honest." Maeve said nothing. She'd been talked over and talked down to her whole life, and she knew when words weren't worth chasing. From a distance, Ethan watched. He stood beneath the archway leading into the ballroom, his posture stiff, a forced smile on his face as another guest droned on about cryptocurrency. But his eyes were fixed on Maeve. He had caught Cynthia's tone, had seen the way his mother stood alone while everyone else mingled in curated cliques. He knew that stance, the composed stillness she took on when the world tried to shrink her. She had worn it through his childhood, through the lean years when people turned up their noses at food stamps and worn shoes. She wore it now, not as armor, but as quiet defiance. Ethan excused himself from the conversation and stepped toward her. She caught him coming, smiled before he reached her. A knowing, gentle smile, the one that always told him not to worry. He stopped beside her and murmured, "You okay?" Maeve looked up at him and placed her hand lightly over his. "I've stood through worse than this, baby," she said softly. "Don't you let them ruin this day for you." Ethan didn't speak. He just nodded, jaw tight. Maeve gave his hand a reassuring squeeze, then turned back to watch the garden again. The music swelled around them. The laughter rose again. But between the cold shoulders and the polished cruelty, Maeve stood untouched. Maeve stood near the edge of a marble-topped buffet table, eyeing a small plate of stuffed mushrooms. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, and even then, it had been rushed, toast and coffee before her morning ride. Her fingers reached delicately for one of the canapes, just as Cynthia Montgomery's voice sliced through the air behind her. "Oh my," Cynthia said with a brittle laugh. "Someone's certainly enjoying herself." The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. The intonation carried, precise and sharp. 2 women beside her, equally polished, equally dismissive, chuckled behind their manicured hands. Maeve froze briefly, the hors d'oeuvre hovering between plate and mouth. She set it down without taking a bite. Slowly, she turned to face Cynthia, who stood with a flute of sparkling rose in one hand and judgment painted across her face like foundation. "I always admire a healthy appetite," Cynthia added, her smile tight. "It's so honest." Maeve met her gaze with quiet steadiness. "Hunger tends to bring out truth in people," she replied, her voice calm, her tone measured. Cynthia blinked, not expecting a reply, much less one that didn't carry apology. Maeve turned back to the table, her appetite gone, though she didn't let that show. She walked away slowly, her posture unshaken. But inside, the sting lingered. Not because it was new, but because after so many years, it still happened. She found a quiet spot on a bench near the edge of the garden, beneath a blooming magnolia tree. Conversation floated past her. Talk of market fluctuations, private school waiting lists, a new vineyard someone had invested in just outside Sonoma. No one looked in her direction. She sat invisible in the middle of extravagance. But her mind was far from empty. These people, Maeve thought, carried themselves like they built this country. But she had lived 100 lifetimes behind their indifference. She had cleaned homes while raising Ethan on her own, built a cleaning business with nothing but grit and referrals, and later mentored other single mothers into financial independence. She had worked 3 jobs at once to pay for her grandson's school uniforms. Every thread of Ethan's tuxedo today had been stitched from the sacrifices she made. They talked of wealth like it was inherited virtue. She saw it for what it often was, unacknowledged luck stacked upon unearned privilege. Still, she didn't resent them. She just pitied how little they truly knew. Maeve watched the party unfold from her shaded perch. Cynthia, again, held court by the champagne station, laughing a little too loudly, her comments laced with performative grace. The guests orbited her, never questioning the pedestal she stood on. They didn't know they were brushing off a woman who once testified before City Council for housing reform, who once built a literacy program for janitorial staff working overnight shifts, who had once, long before this day, sat across from bank managers who refused her loans and found a way anyway. One of the younger women approached Maeve, offering a brief smile before glancing toward the main tent. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" she said politely. Maeve smiled. "It is. A good day to see people clearly." The woman tilted her head, unsure how to respond. "I suppose so," she said, before retreating towards safer, shinier company. Maeve sat still, watching petals drift lazily from the branches above her. She wasn't angry. She was patient. She had learned a long time ago that those who look down from towers often had the weakest foundations. Let them continue to dismiss her, she thought. Let them bask in borrowed legacy. The truth had a way of arriving, uninvited but undeniable. And when it did, she would still be here, quiet, composed, and stronger than any name on a place card. At the far end of the garden, a hush began to ripple through the crowd. The event coordinator, a young man in an impeccably tailored vest and a clipboard glued to his hand, stepped onto the small stage near the head table. He tapped the microphone gently. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with practiced poise, "please give your attention to our next guest, a very special arrival tonight, and a friend of the family." Heads turned. Conversations paused. The hush grew thick with curiosity. A few guests leaned toward one another, whispering in excitement. "Must be one of the donors," someone guessed. "A senator, maybe," said another. Cynthia Montgomery straightened in her chair, smoothing her silk dress with the back of her hand. She exchanged a knowing glance with her husband, Richard. Important people arriving late wasn't unusual. It was expected. She lifted her chin, preparing her best smile for whoever would soon be joining them. Then a tall man in a perfectly fitted charcoal suit entered from the back of the garden, his silver tie catching the light as he walked. His stride was smooth, confident, not rushed but purposeful. "Henry Hargrove." Gasps fluttered through the air like a wave of butterflies. It was that Henry Hargrove, founder of Titan Global Ventures, one of the most recognized names in international investment and tech innovation. Billionaire, philanthropist, a man who could silence a room by simply stepping into it. People reached for their phones, too stunned to speak, but too curious to look away. Cynthia's mouth parted slightly. "What on earth is he doing here?" she whispered. To her surprise, Henry didn't pause at the Montgomery table. He didn't greet the bride and groom. He walked straight past them all. Every CEO, every society name, every politician in waiting. He walked toward Maeve. Maeve Brooks sat quietly near the back, still as a stone amidst a sea of glitter and noise. She looked up, confused at first by the approaching figure. But her expression shifted the moment she recognized him. "Henry," she said, rising slowly. And then he bowed. Not a theatrical gesture, not for show. It was quiet, sincere, a gesture born of respect, not performance. "Miss Maeve," he said, a smile tugging at his lips. "It's been too long." She chuckled softly, the sound light and genuine. "You've traded your overalls for Italian suits, I see." He grinned. "And I owe every stitch to you." The crowd around them had fallen into stunned silence. Even a waitstaff paused mid-step. Henry turned to the guests, scanning the confused faces. "For those of you who don't know," he began, voice clear and even, "this woman right here is the reason I'm standing here today. Maeve Brooks is more than just the grandmother of the groom. She's one of the finest minds I've ever known." A murmur rolled through the crowd. "When I was 23, he continued, I was living out of my car, trying to get a loan with nothing but a prototype and a dream. No one would return my calls. But Maeve, she didn't just return them. She sat with me. She read every page of my business plan. She taught me to present it. And when the bank still said no, she helped me raise my first $10,000 from a group of small business owners who trusted her word." Maeve shifted slightly, embarrassed. "Now, Henry." "No, Maeve," he said, raising his hand. "People need to know. You've mentored dozens, hundreds of entrepreneurs over the years. Quietly, relentlessly, and without seeking a bit of praise. You're the one who taught me that power without purpose is useless." He looked at the stunned crowd. "You're all here chasing legacy," he said. "She is legacy." The silence was absolute. Cynthia Montgomery's face had gone pale. Her wine glass trembled slightly in her grip. Richard's expression had hardened, unable to mask his humiliation. Maeve only smiled, calm, graceful, unshaken. Henry turned back to her and gently kissed the back of her hand. "It's an honor to be here, Miss Maeve," he said, "because tonight, the most powerful person in this garden isn't the one with the biggest name. It's the one most of you didn't even bother to see." For a moment, no one moved. The air that had been filled with boastful conversations and curated laughter now hung heavy with realization, embarrassment, and something else, shame. Henry Hargrove had returned to his seat, calm and content, as if he hadn't just upended an entire room of elites with a few carefully chosen truths. The guests, stunned, exchanged glances with each other, uncertain whether to applaud, speak, or quietly melt into the hedges. Cynthia Montgomery sat frozen, her smile faltering on her lips like chipped porcelain. Her fingers clutched the base of her wine glass, and her eyes, once calculating and sharp, now darted around as if seeking an escape. Richard, beside her, was visibly rattled. The man who often measured worth by bank accounts and board seats now sat looking like a schoolboy, scolded by a teacher. His lips were pursed, jaw tight. The air of superiority that usually clung to him had been stripped bare. It was Ethan who stood first. His chair scraped back against the flagstone, startling even those closest to him. He walked slowly to the center of the gathering, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the crowd, pausing briefly on Cynthia, then resting gently on Maeve. "My mother," he said, his voice steady, "is the most remarkable person I've ever known." The room held its breath. "She's not just the woman who raised me. She's the woman who carried me, built me, fought for me when no one else would. And tonight, she came here with nothing but her quiet grace. And instead of welcoming her, you ignored her, mocked her, dismissed her." His voice cracked slightly, but did not falter. "You all talk about legacy, about greatness and wealth and status like they're trophies you can earn or inherit. But let me tell you something. This woman," he gestured toward Maeve, "has done more with less than any of you could imagine. She taught me that character matters more than money, that kindness outlives bank accounts. That respect is earned not by name, but by the way you treat people, especially when you think no one is watching." A murmur stirred in the back, but no one dared interrupt. "And yet," Ethan continued, turning to face his in-laws, "you chose to disrespect her. The same woman who has lifted up hundreds of lives while you were busy lifting your champagne glasses. Cynthia looked away. Madison, standing nearby, lowered her head. Her fingers twisted around the edge of her clutch, and her expression, so poised just hours earlier, had cracked. The mask of elegance had slipped. She stepped forward. "Maeve," Madison's voice trembled. "I'm so sorry." Her words were genuine, raw. "I saw it happening, and I said nothing. I was too embarrassed, too caught up in keeping everything perfect. But I allowed them to make you feel small, and that's not something I'll ever forgive myself for." Maeve, still seated, looked up slowly. Her expression was unchanged. Serene, unshaken, her dignity intact as always. She studied Madison with quiet eyes. "My dear," she said softly, "I've lived too long and seen too much to be wounded by shallow hearts. You don't owe me guilt. You owe yourself courage. Speak up sooner next time. Not for me, but for what's right." Madison nodded, eyes glassy with unshed tears. As the weight of Maeve's words settled, the guests felt it. Not a lecture, but a reckoning. Maeve stood, slow and graceful, her hands folded calmly in front of her. Her gaze moved across the guests, each person holding still under her quiet command. "Let me say something," she said, and even the waitstaff paused to listen. "Respect," she said gently, "is not something you wear. It's not stitched into your labels or sealed into your wine cellars. It's shown in the way you see people. All people." A breeze passed through the garden, rustling the silk runners on the tables, the lace sleeves on gowns. "Power and wealth have their place," she continued. "But they mean nothing when they cost you the decency to treat others with kindness." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You may not have known who I was," she said, her voice calm but piercing, "but that should have never mattered." The guests stood silent, those with real influence looking humbled, and those who had coasted on name alone looking exposed. Cynthia, sensing the unraveling of everything she thought controlled, forced a brittle smile. She reached for her glass and turned toward Maeve with the brightened charm of a woman used to smoothing over scandal. "Well," she said, voice airy, "that was quite the surprise, wasn't it? Maeve, dear, I hope you'll forgive us. This evening has been overwhelming." Maeve didn't answer. She simply turned her head, just slightly, just enough to indicate she had no intention of entertaining Cynthia's forced reparations. The gesture, subtle and composed, spoke louder than any reprimand could. It was dismissal, not of a woman, but of the performative grace Cynthia clung to like a crumbling fan. And just like that, the spell was broken. The illusion of superiority that had hovered over the Montgomerys evaporated. The guests turned their attention not to the head table or the wealthiest donors, but to Maeve, the quiet matriarch whose strength had endured insult without surrendering a single shred of grace. She had said little all night, but in silence, she had held more weight than all their chatter combined. From that moment on, it was Maeve whom guests gravitated toward, not out of pity, but out of respect, the genuine kind, the rare kind, earned not from name, but from presence. And Maeve, steady as ever, simply smiled, not for revenge, not for validation, but because truth had finally spoken louder than arrogance, and it had been enough. As the evening wore on, the tone of the wedding reception shifted. The superficial chatter that had once filled the garden gave way to quieter, more meaningful murmurs. Guests who had previously flocked to the Montgomerys and their curated circles now gravitated toward Maeve. She stood near a stone fountain, hands clasped loosely in front of her, as people approached with genuine interest, no longer to impress, but to listen. A young tech founder asked about mentorship. A philanthropist inquired about her early community work. An older woman simply said, "I'm sorry I didn't speak to you earlier," before resting a hand over Maeve's and thanking her for her words. Maeve, as always, offered grace without bitterness. She didn't bask in attention. She answered softly, occasionally smiling, her voice steady with wisdom. For many, it was their first time being in the presence of someone who wore power without flaunting it, who moved hearts without raising her voice. Nearby, Olivia Montgomery approached Ethan. Her voice trembled slightly. "I was wrong," she said. "I'll let their voices drown out my own. But I won't let them shape our future." Ethan looked at her, quietly waiting. "I promise you," Olivia continued, "our marriage will be built on truth, on respect, on everything your mother stands for." He didn't speak, only pulled her into an embrace, his eyes searching hers and finding something new: conviction. At the edge of the garden, the Montgomerys sat subdued, contemplative. Cynthia no longer smiled. Richard stared into his untouched drink. They were not used to being humbled, but tonight the truth had reached them. And as the final notes of the quartet echoed into the stars, Maeve stepped to the side, watching her grandson laugh with his new bride beneath a canopy of lights. She felt no pride in being proven right, only peace in having stood her ground. She had not changed the world that evening, but she had revealed it. Respect, she knew, would never be measured in wealth or whispered surnames. It would always live in how people chose to see each other and how bravely they chose to do better. If this story touched your heart, like, share, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more powerful, soul-touching stories that restore faith in humanity.